Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're peeling back the layers on a topic that's grabbed a lot of attention lately, the carnivore diet.
Hmm.
But we're not just defining it. We're zeroing in on a really critical, often, well, underestimated factor for anyone following this way of eating: electrolytes.
Exactly. And to do that, we've pulled together insights from, a stack of sources, including a really comprehensive review provided by redlighttherapy.rehab, which gives us a solid foundation for understanding the why and how of electrolyte management here.
Yeah, that review is great. So our mission today is basically to cut through the noise and hand you the essential knowledge. Why do electrolytes suddenly become such a big deal on a meat-only diet?
Right.
What are the signs your body needs help? And maybe most importantly, what can you actually do about it?
Okay, let's jump in.
So let's start with the basics then. What exactly is the carnivore diet, and why are people drawn to it in the first place?
Well, at its simplest, it's just animal products. Meat, fish, eggs, dairy for some people.
No plant.
No plants allowed. But like you said, our sources highlighted it's not just one single thing. There are quite a few variations, right?
Yeah, they mentioned several.
Absolutely. The sources talked about everything from like really strict beef only or the lion diet, which is just ruminant meat, salt, and water, super restrictive,
Wow.
all the way to broader ideas like nose to tail, so including organ meats or even something called animal-based, which might allow some, specific low-sugar fruits. There's definitely a spectrum.
And people are trying these for a whole range of reported benefits.
Yes, the sources listed quite a few, often based on personal experience or maybe smaller studies, things like significant weight loss.
Yeah, you hear that one a lot.
Definitely.
Oh,
Also, reduction in inflammatory symptoms, improvements in digestive issues, and for some people, benefits for mood and mental clarity.
okay.
There's also the appeal of focusing on nutrient-dense whole foods and maybe using it as a rigorous elimination diet to figure out food sensitivities.
And simplicity.
And let's be honest, for some, the simplicity is a huge plus. Just meat.
Right. But it seems like this simplicity in food choice creates a kind of complexity in the body's mineral balance. This is the core challenge, isn't it? Why does cutting out plants, well, dramatically change your electrolyte needs?
This is where it gets really interesting. When you remove carbohydrates almost entirely, your body, it shifts its primary energy source. So instead of running on glucose from carbs,
Which is what most people do.
exactly, it starts relying heavily on fat, entering a state we call ketosis.
Okay, so the body's metabolism changes gears.
Yeah.
How does that kind of domino effect lead to electrolyte issues?
Well, on a very low-carb diet, particularly in that initial adaptation phase, your insulin levels drop, like significantly.
Right.
And lower insulin sends a pretty clear signal to your kidneys. Basically, hey, we don't need to hold on to sodium anymore. Let's excrete more of it.
Ah, okay. So you're actually peeing out more salt than usual.
Precisely. And because water follows salt, increased sodium excretion means increased urination overall. So you're losing more water. And this flushes out not just sodium, but other vital minerals along with it, primarily potassium and magnesium.
Since you've removed plant foods, which are the main dietary sources of potassium for most people.
You've hit the nail on the head. Your intake of potassium plummets just as your body's losing more of it. It's a real double whammy.
Okay, that makes sense.
And the sources also noted that the potentially higher intake of phosphorus from, a meat-heavy diet might, for some individuals, interfere with how well they absorb magnesium. So that's another potential factor.
So you've got this kind of perfect storm brewing. Losing more, taking in less, and maybe even absorbing less of these key minerals. This rapid depletion is why paying attention is so crucial, especially when you're first starting out.
Absolutely. And for some people, it continues to be important longer term, not just at the beginning.
All right, we keep talking about electrolytes. Maybe let's take a quick step back. What are these things we're losing, and why do they matter so much anyway?
Yeah, good question. Think of electrolytes as minerals dissolved in your body fluids, like your blood, urine, sweat. When they dissolve, they carry an electrical charge.
Okay.
They're essentially the tiny electrical workers that power countless processes in your body.
Like the body's wiring system, sort of?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They're vital for everything from regulating how much fluid is inside and outside your cells to enabling nerve signals and muscle contractions.
Wow.
They play a role in controlling blood pressure, heart rhythm. They support overall cellular function and metabolism. Really fundamental stuff.
The sources listed a few key players in this whole game.
They did. The main ones you'll hear about in this context are sodium, potassium, and magnesium. Those are the big three.
Right.
But calcium, chloride, phosphate, and bicarbonate are also electrolytes the body uses.
And focusing on the ones most impacted by this particular diet shift.
Exactly. Sodium is foundational. It's key for fluid balance, nerve impulses, muscle function. Potassium works really closely with sodium. It's essential for heart health, nerve transmission, muscle contraction, and it helps cells transport nutrients and waste.
Okay.
Then magnesium is a total workhorse. It's involved in hundreds of reactions crucial for nerve and muscle function, bone health, energy production, and particularly muscle relaxation and sleep.
And calcium and chloride. Briefly.
Sure. Calcium is needed for blood vessels, hormone release, blood clotting. Chloride, which comes mainly from salt, helps maintain fluid balance and stomach acid.
And the sources made it really clear these guys don't work alone. They're like a team, right?
Exactly right. They're all interconnected. If one is out of balance, it can totally affect the levels and function of the others. You can't really isolate them.
And thankfully, your body usually gives you pretty clear signals when this balance is off. Many people experience this when starting a very low-carb diet, often calling it the keto flu or, in this context, the carnivore flu.
Yes, precisely. Those uncomfortable symptoms often track directly back to these electrolyte imbalances. It's not some mysterious illness.
Right. So we're talking about things like fatigue, headaches, muscle cramps, maybe twitches, just general weakness.
Feeling dizzy or lightheaded, especially when you stand up quickly. That's a classic one.
Yeah.
You might notice your heart rate feels a bit off, like palpitations, or maybe experience some confusion or irritability. Nausea, vomiting, or that weird pins and needles feeling in your hands or feet can also be signs.
Digestive changes too, right? Like constipation or diarrhea.
Yep, those can happen. And a really, really classic one from the sources: intense salt cravings.
Oh, yeah. That's your body talking.
It really is. That salt craving is your body practically yelling at you for sodium. The review from redlighttherapy.rehab actually included a powerful personal example, someone having extreme thirst and a desperate need for salt after surgery. It's a visceral illustration of the body's immediate need and signal when electrolytes are depleted.
Wow. So things like insomnia, poor workout recovery, even maybe bloating after eating something salty could also be clues.
They could, yes. It all points towards an imbalance that needs attention.
The key takeaway here is that those symptoms aren't just something to push through, right? They're important messages. Ignoring them just makes the transition way harder and can really impact your well-being.
Totally agreed. So let's dive deeper into the big three, then sodium, potassium, and magnesium, because these seem to be the most common culprits when symptoms arise on a carnivore diet.
Okay, starting with sodium, the sources really emphasize this is not the time to be shy with the salt shaker.
Absolutely not. On a very low-carb diet, because of those lower insulin levels we talked about, your kidneys are actively flushing out sodium.
Right.
So if you don't consciously increase your intake, your blood volume drops, and that's what causes that fatigue, dizziness, brain fog. The classic keto flu or carnivore flu symptoms, your body craves salt for a very good reason.
How much are we actually talking about, though? Because it seems so counterintuitive to everything we usually hear about limiting salt.
And that's a key insight from the sources. The conventional advice about restricting salt often just doesn't apply here because of the metabolic shift. It's a different physiological state.
Okay.
The recommendations we saw generally range from 4 to 6 grams of sodium per day for moderate activity.
Oh, just 6 grams, okay.
If you're highly active, sweating a lot, maybe live in a hot climate, it could easily be 6 to 8 grams of sodium or maybe even more daily.
And just to clarify that, because sodium and salt are different things, 4 to 6 grams of sodium is about 10-15 grams of salt. That's roughly, what, 2 to 3 teaspoons?
Yep, around there.
And 6 to 8 grams of sodium is 15-20 grams of salt, so maybe 3 to 4 teaspoons or more. That is a significant amount compared to standard advice.
It really sounds like, but you have to remember, your body is actively expelling it. It's not accumulating in the same way it might on a high-carb diet where your body tends to hold on to sodium more readily.
Does the type of salt matter much? Like Himalayan pink salt versus regular table salt.
Sources mentioned using unrefined sea salt or Himalayan salt because they contain other trace minerals, which could be beneficial.
Okay.
But they also noted that, look, regular table salt works just fine for the primary need here, which is getting enough sodium and chloride. The trace minerals are a potential bonus, not strictly essential for avoiding the main deficiency symptoms.
And how should you get that much salt in? Just dumping it all in your steak.
Well, you certainly should salt your food liberally, but Sipping water with salt added throughout the day is often more effective for consistent intake and better absorption.
Like an electrolyte drink.
Exactly. Just avoid drinking huge amounts of really salty water all at once, and that can overwhelm your system and potentially cause digestive upset. Sipping is key.
Okay, sodium handled. Next up, potassium sodium's partner in crime, particularly for fluid balance.
Right. Potassium is absolutely critical for so many functions, and it helps balance sodium levels. If your sodium intake drops too low, your kidneys actually try to compensate by holding on to sodium, but then they excrete more potassium to do it.
Oh, so it can make the potassium imbalance even worse.
Exactly. It's a tricky balance.
And here's that big challenge again. Taking out plants means taking out most of your typical dietary potassium source.
Precisely. Meat alone, especially muscle meat, often just doesn't provide enough potassium to meet the body's needs, particularly when excretion might be increased due to the low-carb state.
Do the sources give us an idea of how much potassium is actually in typical carnivore foods?
Yeah, they provided some estimates. Beef is around, say, 300 milligrams per 100 grams. Organ meats are generally better. Beef heart is maybe 400, 500 milligrams per 100 gram. Liver, around 400 to 50 milligrams.
Okay, higher, but still.
Still requires significant amounts. Bone broth can offer about 100, 300 milligrams per cup, depending on how it's made. Sardines, especially with the bones, are decent, around 400 milligrams per 100 grams.
And the target intake on this kind of diet, what were the recommendations?
The recommendations we saw were generally around 3 to 4.8 grams per day. That's 3,000 to 4,800 milligrams.
Wow. Okay, let's process that.
Mm-hmm.
To get even the low end, 3 grams or 3,000 milligrams, just from those food sources,
Mm-hmm.
you need to eat like a kilogram over 2 pounds of liver or heart,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe 10 cups of bone broth, or some combination of a massive amount of muscle meat plus other sources
Mm-hmm.
every single day. It really highlights why supplementation often becomes necessary for potassium.
It absolutely shows the potential gap. It's hard to rely solely on food for that amount for most people. For supplementation, the sources listed options like potassium chloride. That's what's common in salt substitutes like no salt or light salt,
Right.
or other forms like potassium citrate or potassium gluconate, which you might find in dedicated supplements.
And this is where we need a major, major safety warning. This isn't like sodium.
Absolutely critical point. The sources emphatically warn against taking large doses of potassium all at once. Anything over maybe 1,000 milligrams, but really, even single doses higher than 200, 300 milligrams should be approached with extreme caution unless you're specifically directed by a doctor.
Why is that?
High potassium levels in the blood, hyperkalemia can be dangerous, potentially affecting heart rhythm. It's much, much safer and more effective to spread moderate doses, say 200, 500 milligrams throughout the day. Maybe add a little to your salted water.
Okay, good advice.
And critically, if you have any kidney issues or are on certain medications, particularly blood pressure meds or diuretics, you must consult a doctor before supplementing with potassium at all. Seriously.
Got it. So sip salty water, spread out small potassium doses.
Okay.
The third pillar, magnesium.
Yes, magnesium. Vital for nerve function, muscle relaxation, think cramps, twitches, restless legs, also energy levels, sleep quality, stress response. And it's another one that gets lost through urine and sweat, and stress itself can deplete it.
And deficiency is pretty common in the general population anyway, right? So it makes sense it would be an issue here too.
Exactly. The sources noted it's a very common deficiency, even off this diet. Recommended intake is often suggested around 400 milligrams per day for most people on keto or carnivore, maybe higher if you're very active or under a lot of stress.
Are there any particularly good meat sources for magnesium?
Well, fatty fish like mackerel were mentioned as being better, maybe around 100 milligrams per 100 grams serving.
Okay.
But muscle meat like beef is much lower, only about 20 milligrams per 100 grams. So again, hitting those 400 milligram plus targets purely for meat is challenging. Supplementation is often needed.
And like potassium, there are different forms of magnesium supplements that might have slightly different effects.
Yes, the sources discuss this. Magnesium glycinate is often favored because the glycine can have a calming effect, potentially helping with sleep. Magnesium malate is sometimes suggested for energy support, as malate is involved in energy cycles, and magnesium taurate might be beneficial for heart rhythm support.
So how should someone start if they think they need magnesium?
Generally start with a lower dose, maybe 200 milligrams, perhaps up to 400 milligrams per day, often taken in the evening for the relaxation benefits. See how you feel.
Okay.
The main thing to adjust based on is digestive tolerance. Too much magnesium at once can cause loose stools or diarrhea for some people, so finding your bowel tolerance level is key.
Any alternatives if the pills cause issues?
Yes, the sources also pointed out topical magnesium, things like magnesium oil sprays or lotions, as a potential way to absorb it through the skin and maybe bypass those digestive issues altogether. Some people find that works well.
Interesting. Okay, so we've covered the big three: sodium, potassium, magnesium. What about calcium and chloride? Are they usually major concerns on carnivore?
Generally less so, according to the sources. Calcium is obviously essential for bone health, muscle function, blood clotting. But the suggestion is you're usually fine if you include some dairy, if tolerated, or small bone-in fish like sardines, or regularly consume well-made bone broth.
So supplement only if you're strictly eliminating all of those.
Pretty much. If your version of carnivore excludes dairy, bones, and broth, then you might need to consider calcium. Otherwise, probably okay.
And chloride.
Chloride is almost entirely tied to your salt intake, since salt is sodium chloride. If you're getting enough sodium, based on those higher recommendations we discussed,
Then you're getting plenty of chloride.
you're almost certainly getting enough chloride. It's important for fluid balance and also for making stomach acid, which is, pretty important when you're digesting a lot of meat. So adequate salt intake covers chloride.
Right. Okay, so armed with all this knowledge, what are some practical, maybe even DIY strategies people can use to manage all this, especially when starting out?
Well, the sources recommend starting with simpler, more natural approaches first, making something called soul water, which sounds fancy, but it's just water fully saturated with unrefined mineral salt.
How does that help?
Dissolving the salt fully in water helps ensure you're getting those minerals in a really bioavailable form ready for your body to use. It's an easy way to start adding salt and trace minerals. Topical magnesium, as we mentioned, is another natural type option to potentially avoid fillers sometimes found in electrolyte powders or pills.
Soul water sounds pretty easy. Any other sort of general tips for that transition phase that came up?
Yeah, the sources had a good list of broader transition tips, things like maybe gradually reducing carbs instead of going cold turkey, which can ease the metabolic shift.
Makes sense.
Making sure you increase your fat and protein intake enough to feel satisfied. Staying well hydrated is obviously key, but crucially, this means hydrating with electrolytes, not just plain water, which can worsen the flushing effect.
Right. Don't just chug plain water.
Exactly. Bone broth can be helpful for electrolytes and gut health, although some sources caution about histamine issues for sensitive people. Light exercise can support metabolic flexibility. Finding community support, people who know the ropes, can be invaluable. And always, mindful eating, really paying attention to how your body responds to food and supplements.
Okay. And for someone who wants a more measured approach, like a DIY electrolyte drink they can sip.
Yes. The review from redlighttherapy.rehab specifically offered a great starting recipe for a DIY mix. They suggested, per liter of water, adding 1 to 1.5 teaspoons of unrefined sea salt for the sodium and chloride.
Okay. 1 to 1.5 teaspoons salt.
Then 14 to 12 teaspoons of potassium chloride, that's the no salt, light salt stuff for potassium.
Quarter to half teaspoon potassium chloride.
And finally, about 200 to 400 milligrams of elemental magnesium powder, like magnesium glycinate or malate.
200, 400 milligram magnesium.
Got it. And you can sip that throughout the day. They also mention you could add a squeeze of lemon for taste, or even some taurine powder if you like.
That's a really practical, actionable recipe. Nice. So, on the flip side, what are the big mistakes to avoid? What are people commonly doing wrong with electrolytes on this diet?
Yeah, the sources explicitly called out several common pitfalls. A big one is oversalting food without also ensuring adequate potassium intake to balance it out. Remember, they work together.
Right, don't just focus on salt.
Exactly. Another huge one is drinking only plain water, especially large amounts. This dilutes your existing electrolytes and actually causes your kidneys to flush even more out. Counterproductive.
Okay.
Then there's the fear of salt, people avoiding it even when their body is clearly craving it because of old dietary advice. That's a common issue. Taking large doses of potassium all at once, we covered the danger there, needs repeating. Avoid that. And finally, ignoring magnesium when symptoms like cramps, twitching, poor sleep, or maybe anxiety pop up. Magnesium is often the missing piece there.
That gives you a pretty solid roadmap for managing electrolytes, especially during that adaptation phase. But the sources also raised an interesting point about when electrolyte dependency might signal something else is going on.
Yes, that was an important nuance. If you've been following a carnivore diet for a significant period, let's say 6 months or longer, and you still feel like you need significant amounts of electrolyte supplementation just to function and feel well,
Like you can't reduce them without feeling bad.
Exactly. If you're heavily reliant long term, it might be a sign that there's something deeper going on. The diet might be masking or managing symptoms of an underlying condition, but not resolving the root cause.
What kind of conditions?
The sources mention possibilities like chronic inflammatory response syndrome or CIRS as one example. Basically, an underlying health challenge that means the body just needs way more support, and the electrolyte need is a symptom of that rather than just the diet itself after adaptation should have occurred.
So in those cases, the diet alone might not be the full answer.
Precisely. It might be helping, but not fixing the root cause. That's when a thorough medical evaluation by a knowledgeable practitioner is really recommended to look for those potential underlying issues.
And that ties perfectly into our essential disclaimer here. This deep dive is all about informing you based on the sources we reviewed, including that great one from redlighttherapy.rehab.
Absolutely. This is educational content. We
Mm.
always have to emphasize consult with a qualified healthcare practitioner before making significant dietary changes or starting any new supplement regimen, especially if you have existing health conditions or are taking any medications. Self-experimentation needs guardrails.
Definitely. So wrapping this up, what does this all really mean for you if you're considering or currently following a carnivore diet?
Well, our deep dive today, drawing heavily from that comprehensive review by redlighttherapy.rehab and these other expert sources, clearly shows that drastically cutting carbs fundamentally alters how your body handles electrolytes. It's not a minor tweak.
Yeah, it's a major shift. And paying close attention to sodium, potassium, and magnesium is, well, it seems pretty non-negotiable, especially during that transition period. Getting it right seems key to avoiding those miserable flu symptoms and actually feeling the potential benefits of the diet.
For sure. And it's not just about pouring on the salt, though that's part of it. It's about understanding the specific needs for all three, sodium, potassium, magnesium, and finding a balance that works for your body, listening to those signals.
We've walked through the metabolic why behind the changes, the vital roles of these key minerals, the common symptoms of imbalance to watch for, and some really practical strategies gleaned from the sources, including how to make your own electrolyte support mix.
Mm-hmm.
And a big thank you once more to redlighttherapy.rehab for providing that foundational review that really gave us such a great starting point for digging into this.
Agreed. You know, this whole topic, it really raises a fascinating question, doesn't it? Given how interconnected our bodily systems clearly are, and how a change in one seemingly simple factor like diet composition can profoundly impact something as fundamental as fluid and mineral balance. What other subtle interconnected effects might our daily choices be having on our health that we're simply not aware of yet?
That's a great thought to end on. Definitely something to ponder.